Hello everyone. In this little video, I would like to tell you the whole truth that you may not know. The problem is that Ukraine has the largest corruption in the world. It was before, but not on such a large scale. Let's start with the fact that corruption in this country has become nothing more than a system of governance. Ukraine is a very rich country in terms of its nature, and was one of the best pieces of land after the collapse of the USSR. In this country, you can extract practically all types of the periodic table, as the soil is very rich in various types of metals, food products, and much more. The country can provide practically the whole of Europe with wheat and agricultural products if it worked to the maximum. The mild climate and fertile land are suitable for growing practically all types of crops. And this is just the small potential of this country. But what is happening in this country? Why was the state of the economy so bad even before the war with the Russian Federation? There is a very convincing reason for this. Namely the thieving and gangster way of ruling the territory. Starting from 1991, when the country broke away from the USSR, which basically laid the foundation and basis for the thieving mechanism of governance. Originally, people came to power who introduced such a system, replacing the old currency, which was no longer valid, with a new national currency that turned out to be much more expensive, making people 5 times poorer after the collapse. The instinct and thirst to have everything immediately after the communist country won in power and began to build various mafia ways of governance, which became the basis. Starting with the first president of the country, namely Kravchuk, and then Leonid Kuchma, who continued to develop the system of theft from the state budget, finally gained an understanding of the oligarchy. Everything in the industrial country was stolen in extremely large quantities, all resources were destroyed and sold in parts. Only people involved in the thieving system were allowed into the authorities. And as the years went by, they built themselves a nest, with the help of which they were able to firmly establish themselves in power and in all state structures. Already in the early 2000s, they created such conditions for people that they would emigrate, while they themselves. The power was strengthening more and more, promising the people a better future. Gas theft, energy theft, raw material theft, as well as people's taxes, forced them to create a system of oligarchs, namely people who filled their pockets more than others after the collapse of the USSR. Oligarchy is nothing more than thieves in law, or legalized criminals, who have no concept of morality or humanity. A lot of time has passed and the people of Ukraine have always continued to believe in miracles and that changes will come to the country, which will bring with them economic growth of every citizen and prosperity of democracy. But the problem of the oligarchy had no boundaries. In 2014, the people were once again lied to in order to overthrow the then president of the country, namely Viktor Yanukovych. Propaganda at the highest level about how he steals from the country was nothing more than a competitive struggle between clans. One clan was pro-Russian, and the other clan pretended to be pro-Ukrainian, while doing well, working and having a business in Russia. In other words, an artificial revolution was created, with the help of which the pro-Ukrainian clan played a very patriotic role, to divert attention from the real reasons for this so-called revolution, which was not really a revolution for people in the know. Because of this revolution, a split occurred between people and opinions. In turn, the pro-Ukrainian clan, led by Petro Poroshenko, was still able to take the presidential seat. And by doing so, they began to morally pressure people with their national views for a certain split in society and thus maintain power as patriots, although they themselves were not such. Furthermore, since Ukraine was highly dependent on Russia after the collapse of the USSR, as Russian clans remained in the territory of the new Ukraine for many years after the Union, oligarchs and various clans built their businesses for decades by extorting and stealing from the country's treasury. They became very accustomed to this fast way of enrichment in banks in Panama and all sorts of foreigners. They took and built their own system, suppressing the rights and lives of ordinary people. The difference between the rich and the poor was already felt in the early 2000s. And since the clans from Russia and Ukraine were initially in power in the regions of the country, naturally the Russian clans did not want to let go of the tasty piece of territory. They began to sponsor the so-called separatists from the eastern region of the country for destabilization. And knowing that in Ukraine many ethnic Russians remained to live after the collapse of the Soviet Union, they decided to play a wicked game. Touching on history and allegedly Ukraine's entry into NATO, a split was created in another propaganda from the past century. At the same time, the pro-Ukrainian oligarchy did not waste time and also engaged in propaganda. This propaganda has reached such a level that the ordinary population has forgotten about real problems and about salaries in €100 and pensions of €50. People were simply distracted by the turmoil with separatists, while the oligarchs were stuffing their pockets with millions of artificially allocated money for the development of the state. Time passed, and the war in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics with separatists sponsored by the Russians continued. Oligarch fought against oligarch with other people's hands, the ordinary people. The country began to sharply and even further decline in its rating. Corruption flourished like bamboo in the forest. More and more oligarchs were becoming rich. The war in eastern Ukraine was a kind of war between ruling oligarchs, who brainwashed and distracted the people with supposed patriotic disagreements. They instilled patriotism and freedom in people, which didn't really exist among them. After all, they themselves became patriots only when they saw an opportunity to consolidate their power and continue filling their pockets. By embezzling from the state budget during the war in eastern Ukraine, they continued to steal from the army and taxes. They built villas in the most expensive areas and bought the most expensive real estate in expensive places in Europe and around the world. Their most expensive cars from top global manufacturers, villas, yachts, luxury brands, and the royal way of life in general divided the statuses of people in the country. It is impossible to imagine that pensioners or disabled people have almost no assistance, and now they have been added to them. Military soldiers. Pensions of €50, but with prices like in the average European country, it forced many people to emigrate and seek their happiness in other civilized countries. A law that doesn't work at all, business seizure, or the destruction of various sources of information led to the concentration of people through manipulation, emphasizing patriotism, and they gained the desired benefit, namely the people's trust in them. People, knowing about all the problems with corruption and dishonesty in the country, about the problems with laws in the hands of people in power, simply forgot. But there was a war in eastern Ukraine, privatization was happening in the hands of oligarchs, and while all this was happening, people were being instilled with hatred, and all the responsibility for it was attributed to some Russians who have identical problems but are lucky to have constant gas supply. They suffered because of the loss of control over the territory of Ukraine in 1991. But today we will not talk about Russia. There are reasons to talk about Ukraine, or rather about its government, which consists of clans that have nothing to do with real politics but are still involved in politics, and came to power after Poroshenko, the darling of the public, a well-known comedian and actor, young and seemingly genuine and sincere Vladimir Vladimirovich Zelensky. Initially, his people loved him very much and saw him as the best in the history of their country. After all, he always seemed like a cheerful person. And seemingly positive, he also inspired. His promises to end the shootouts in eastern Ukraine played an important role in the elections, where in the end he met with the then acting president, an oligarch, even during the conflict with Russia has business there, strangely enough. If you think about it, isn't it strange that his chocolate is sold by the enemy? Nevertheless, the young and very talented Vladimir Zelensky managed to win the elections in 2019. At that time, there was only one strange thing. Namely that Mr. Zelensky had excellent relations with the oligarch, the bandit, the owner of the country's main bank, a man who took everything from everyone, the so-called Igor Kolomoisky. A billionaire who played a huge role and became Zelensky's sponsor in principle. People knew and understood that these were strange connections for such a good president. Maybe he is not what people thought. But time showed and put many dots over the I. Even before the start of the war, Zelensky's rating dropped significantly among his supporters. People felt deception and empty promises, just like in the early 2000s from others. People felt used once again. But at the same time, Shootouts with separatists fully sponsored by the Russian Federation continued. People were still leaving from the country, in search of new stability. Meanwhile, Zelensky was warned by the Pentagon about a full-scale invasion by Russia. At the helm of Ukraine, everyone knew about the reality of the invasion at that time. But at the same time, no one warned the people about the invasion, and through various channels, they continued to instill calmness in the people. Meanwhile, the oligarchs and politicians themselves, a couple of days before the invasion, began to evacuate their relatives, friends, and acquaintances abroad. By the way, the people did not know about this. They withdrew money through offshore companies and suddenly started buying real estate in Europe. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people are naturally panicking and completely distracted by defending and protecting their families and territories. And here comes the moment. The moment for the authorities. The president and his own selected company immediately adapted to various economic inflows into the country, receiving billions of euros in aid, while stealing 90% of it. They also started privatize what has not yet been taken from the people. The law has become inactive for the ordinary citizen. All TV channels that showed any kind of criticism towards the authorities were simply closed, at best. They have completely taken everything for themselves. At the same time, they are instilling in ordinary people that there is a war going on and that they need to defend the country and the territories of Ukraine. But none of them or their relatives, friends, acquaintances, or simply neighbors went to fight for the country. They, on the contrary, came up with another way to steal from the poor people who were already poor. Specifically, it is the collection of money for the army, or so-called donations. During the month of war, hundreds of different donations were invented, most of which were controlled by people close to power. Many of these donations never reached the intended direction. Many simply turned into villas in Spain and the coolest cars. Nevertheless, Ukraine needed help like never before. The United States and the European Union allocated billions of dollars in economic aid since the beginning of the war, but the question is, where is it? Meanwhile, people and children are disappearing in the country. How many missing without a trace? There is a crackdown on businesses and human rights violations. The authorities of Ukraine are loudly proclaiming that they are fighting corruption, but they themselves are leading it. Human rights do not work in Ukraine for ordinary citizens. The country has the lowest salaries and pensions for ordinary people. Please look on the internet how much property Ukrainian oligarchs have it. Does the world not see what is happening? This is only a small part of what I roughly described in this text. The help of the world goes into their pockets, people suffer and die like insects. The power of the country is completely engulfed in corruption. They call everyone who is against them traitors or collaborators. People simply disappear. I am sure that not all of them are collaborators. Maybe they just got in the way. The stage of dictatorship in the 21st century is fully underway. Ordinary people, men are taken away by beating them in the middle of the street in case of resistance to go and fight for this corrupt government and their millions. Immediately ordinary people are put in the front lines for extermination. How many people have they made disappear without a trace so as not to pay their families after death in war? How many women and children have disappeared or been sold into slavery or for organs? By the way, they recently released a child trafficker on bail. How can this be in a civilized country? Do influential countries not have the power to influence this? The complete extermination of ordinary people is happening. I ask influential people of the world not to remain indifferent, but to help ordinary people. There is no need to listen to this corrupt government. We need to listen to the people. We need to establish order in the country regardless of whether it will be in NATO or not. During the war, the authorities of Ukraine allocate the money sent to them. Help against war by any means, thereby laundering the state budget. This is just an example. To the stadium during the war, to the sidewalks while everything is collapsing and there is a shortage of clean water in the south, to the drums for bomb shelters, to the TV series on the main channel, to various unnecessary events at a time when people have nothing to eat, to various manipulations that are now inappropriate. And all this, during the war. Hundreds of millions of euros are spent on laundering their theft. After which Mr. Zelensky arrives at another summit and pretends to be the biggest patriot of his nation. It's very funny to watch. And the understanding of his hypocrisy just makes you pay attention to what's happening. In the last few years, the oligarchs have become even richer, and their ordinary people have become new oligarchs. Journalists have repeatedly noticed the purchase of luxurious plots of land, transferred to their relatives or dummy individuals. If the European Union were somehow interested in this, it would be a huge step in the process against these clans, oligarchs, thieves, murderers, and their next people. In our time, everything can be learned, as well as seen where many stolen funds are allocated. I would very much like for this to spread and for people who live their only life, who dream of dying because of poor, the most mercenary and corrupt power. I would like for them to start living normally, in accordance with their rights and the law, which should work for the people, not for clans.